It was during the dark winter of 1864 at Petersburg, Virginia, the Confederate Army of Robert E. Lee faced the Union divisions of General Ulysses S. Grant. The war was now 3.5 years old, and the glorious charge had long since given way to the muck and the mud of trench warfare. Late one evening, one of Lee's generals, by the name of Major General George Pickett, received word that his wife had given birth to a beautiful baby boy. Up and down the line, the Southerners began building huge bonfires in celebration of the event. Now, these fires did not go unnoticed in the northern camps, and soon a very nervous Grant sent out a reconnaissance patrol to see just exactly what was going on. The scouts returned with the message that Pickett had had a son, and these were celebratory fires. It's interesting that it just so happened that Grant and Pickett had been contemporaries at West Point, and they knew each other very well. So to honor the occasion, Grant, too, ordered the bonfires to be built. What an amazingly peculiar night that was. For miles on both sides, both lines, fires burned, no shots fired, no yelling back and forth, no war fought. There was only light. Light that celebrated the birth of a child. But it didn't last forever. Soon the fires burned down, and once again the darkness took over. The darkness of the night and the darkness of war. As we come together on this Christmas Eve of 2011, the good news of Christmas is that in the midst of a great darkness, there came a light, and the darkness was never able to overcome that light. It was not just a temporary flicker. It was an eternal flame. And that is important for us to remember and reflect upon. Because there are times in the events of our world and in the events of our own personal lives when we feel that the light of the world, the light of our lives, might just be snuffed out. But the Christmas story affirms that no matter what happens, the light still shines. The Christmas story, the reality of what took place 2,000 years ago, was very much different from how we play it out in our very sanitized versions and our pageants. It was far from cute little sheep and a shepherd boy with a glowing face and a beating drum. It was a time of brutal Roman domination. Herod was taxing and tormenting the Jewish people. Mary was an unwed teenage mother who had betrayed her betrothed husband, Joseph. Their lives and life at the time was extremely messy. The director of one of our Christmas movies, entitled The Nativity Story, in doing research for her movie, was shocked that Mary might have been 13 years old at the time. And she wondered, how could this young girl deal with such difficulties? So her movie, The Nativity, became centered around Mary's plight. And her movie reminds us that Mary and Joseph were not celebrated in their time as Christmas pageants celebrate them today. They were actually outcasts from proper society. So as we listen to that gospel this evening, let us for just a second read between the lines of that gospel and reflect upon the doubts and the fears that were an overwhelming part of that first Christmas. There's a sequence of dialogue in the movie that certainly is not contained in the Bible, but it has Mary and Joseph sitting by a river in the midst of their long and wearying journey to Bethlehem. And Mary asks Joseph if he's scared. And Joseph looks at Mary and says, "Yes, I am scared." And Mary says, "Joseph, so am I." It's a scary time. 2,000 years ago, on the night of nights, the central figures of the story we love to tell so much and act out were scared. They were filled with fear and terror. How very interesting that God chose to become one of us in the messiest of ways. How interesting that God chose to become one of us through an unwed, pregnant teenager. On a night where no one would give them a place to stay, they were on the run, they were fearful, they were scared. Now, that messy world of 2,000 years ago is not much unlike our very scary and messy world of today. And thus, I believe that all of us can easily connect with the anxiety that Mary and Joseph experienced, with their fear and their terror. We may have spent the last few weeks or months decorating our homes and singing carols and driving ourselves crazy with shopping and holiday parties. But I think all of us admit that underneath the facade of all of that, we all know what the family of Joseph and Mary felt that first Christmas, what they experienced that first Christmas. And perhaps that's why we need Christmas more than ever this year. Perhaps that's why we need God to desperately break into our world this year once again. We need to light those bonfires, not for just one evening, because we need that light of Christmas to shine on us. So we come together this Christmas of 2011. We approach the crib. We reflect upon that story. And we are also scared. We're scared for our world. We're scared for our community. We're scared for our church, our families, marriages, jobs. We're scared for our young people. We fear the powder keg that's in the Middle East. We're anxious at the lack of leadership in those who wish to lead our nation. We're embarrassed by the notoriety that our community has experienced these last few weeks. We're in shock over the abuse of our children. We're wearied by the changes in our church. We're worn out by the unemployment numbers. Oh yes, I think we can relate to what Mary and Joseph felt as they huddled in the darkness that night. But it's in the midst of all of this, it's in the midst of all of our shared darkness and all of our personal darkness with our sicknesses and our losses, our failures and our experiences of abandonment, that Christmas happens once again. A light comes into this overwhelming darkness, and once again, we are told that there is hope. We do not have to despair. It was during that dark winter of 1864. It was in the midst of a civil war that the horror of the war ceased momentarily. A child was born, and all those who were enemies rejoiced, and bonfires were lit up and down the coast of this great nation. I think on this Christmas of 2011, we are all challenged to light those bonfires once again. We are challenged to cease the wars that are going on in our world, in our nation, in our Congress, in our community, in our families, in your marriages, in our own personal hearts. We're called to celebrate a new birth inside of ourselves, a birth of peace, a birth of cooperation, of dialogue, and a willingness to work together to create a world that is better for all of us to live in. C.S. Lewis writes that there is a hunger in human beings for joy and meaning that will not be set aside for even the most difficult of circumstances. We need to remember one thing. 2,000 years ago, Jesus did not come, God did not break into our world to provide an occasion to sing carols, to drink toasts, to feast and exchange gifts. Those are good things. We need to do those things even in the most difficult of circumstances. But God broke into our world, Jesus came into our world to bring joy and peace. The joy that overcomes sorrow, and the only kind of peace that ultimately matters. What a peculiarly amazing night that was in the winter of 1864. A child was born. The war stopped. Hearts were changed. Bonfires were lit. There was momentary peace. Tonight, we celebrate the birth of a child. Let us light those bonfires. Let us keep them lit. Let us all work to stop the wars in our world, in our nation, in our community, in your marriages, in our families, and right inside here, in our own selves.